core of Frank's ideas, I would argue, basically turn on this question of how does human organization evolve over time. You see him thinking about the practicalities. That's at the core of some of his agenda now on institutions and governance and bureaucracy, and the balance between the autonomy that a bureaucracy might need to have to perform effectively, but the need for it to be accountable as well.
To me, it means basically the ability of a government to deliver the basic services, security, education, health, infrastructure that governments are supposed to be able to provide their citizens. Some people think that governance is something that's done by organizations other than governments, like NGOs or transnational actors. But I think appropriately the focus ought to be on the public sector and the ability of the public sector to do things that help citizens. I think there's been a critical recognition that institutions are really important. That is to say, political structures like property rights, like stability, like the ability of commercial transactions to take place under a rule of law that are actually the foundations of economic growth, and that what makes poor countries poor is not the lack of resources. You know, Japan and Korea had no resources to speak of when they began their development paths. Rather, it's the lack of institutions that makes countries poor, and therefore there's been an intense focus on helping poor countries to develop stronger institutions. Corruption has a lot of different variations and correspondingly many definitions. Most people would say that corruption is the private appropriation of public resources. If I steal from the public treasury as a policeman or a politician and put it in a bank account for my own family. There's other forms of behavior that are related to corruption, like patronage. So a politician will put his own supporters or her own supporters in a public bureaucracy simply because they showed up for a rally to get that person elected. I think that many people would say, well, corruption isn't that bad because you pay a little bribe and it greases the wheels of the machinery of government and it gets you the ticket fixed or it gets you a permit, more quickly. I think, though, that that can only be said in a country where governance is really defective, because you really shouldn't be paying for those permits in the first place. There are both economic and political consequences to corruption. So corruption is unfair. It means that money is going out of the pockets of citizens into the pockets usually of elites of one sort or another. It distorts public priorities, so you bribe a politician to spend money on a fighter aircraft rather than, rather than schools. And it has big political consequences, because I would say that one of the biggest failings of many countries attempting to transition to democracy is the fact that they're corrupt. It delegitimizes otherwise democratic regimes, and the failure, I think, to provide these basic government services is one of the things that disappoints people about the performance of democracy. So I think it's also important in that political sense in preserving the legitimacy of a regime. Many developing countries, for example, experience patronage and clientelism, beginning with the United States in the 19th century. But if you look at the politics of modern India or Brazil or Mexico, you see that a lot of the political parties and the politicians are in the habit of basically doling out public money in order to generate political support. You can take much more severe cases like Nigeria, where recently there was a case, this country is now being racked by Islamist terrorism, this group Boko Haram that captured several hundred schoolgirls and has been bombing and assassinating people. So the government provides more money for the army to beef up their security, and the money just disappears before it gets to a single soldier. What's the consequence of corruption? The consequence is living in a country with a lot of riches, you've got tremendous continuing poverty. I think actually one of the most interesting cases is actually that of the United States. And it's I think it's an inspiring story for contemporary developing countries, because there's this tendency in the developed world to look down on corrupt developing countries and say, there's something wrong with them. They don't understand what good government is and honest politicians. But in fact, I think this is a universal phenomenon. And in the United States, in the 19th century, the country had something called the patronage system, in which virtually every public official at a federal, state, and local level was the result of a patronage appointment. It was a favor being paid by some politician in exchange for votes. And it led to very poor quality government in the United States. And one of the things that happened in the progressive era, beginning in the 1880s, was that Americans began to mobilize, and they got, because they were sick of corruption, organizations like Tammany Hall in New York that were notorious, dens of influence peddling and graft. And so there was a big mobilization that brought together people that, they were middle class professionals, they were merchants that didn't want to have to pay the extra bribes. There were social reformers that thought that these corrupt politicians were really ripping off the poor. And as a result of their ability to come together and work through a democratic political system, they began first with the passage of something known as the Pendleton Act that created the first Civil Service Commission that said that from now on federal employees had to take a civil service examination, that they wouldn't just be given a job because of a politician, and that merit would be the basis for government service. And it was a struggle that went on for almost 2 generations in order to spread the classified civil service to cover most of the bureaucracy, but it's something that was successful by the 1920s or 30s. This also feeds into my most recent book, which is the second volume of a 2-volume series, which is entitled Political Order and Political Decay. And the central issue in this book really has to do with how did you get to a modern, relatively clean, uncorrupt, effective state? What was the magic sauce by which this happened in places like Denmark or Germany or Japan or Britain, and what lessons does that hold for contemporary developing countries? In the book, I've come to a number of conclusions, and some of them are a little bit pessimistic. The main inspiration for this book was Samuel Huntington's classic work, Political Order in Changing Societies. Samuel Huntington was a Harvard political scientist. He wrote this book back in 1968, and the basic message of that book was all good things do not go together, because previously the theory and development had been that all good things did go together. If you had economic growth, the growth of individual freedom, social mobilization, economic change, that all of this would be mutually self-supportive and it would support modern democracy. And Huntington looked around the world at the time in the 1960s and said, well, that doesn't seem to be happening, that in fact economic growth spurs social mobilization, demands for participation, countries don't meet it, and then you get coups, civil wars, and a lot of political instability. And in many respects, I think that I agree with him. I think that fundamental insight is correct. And so there are certain trade-offs that you have to make between, for example, good governance on the one hand, and democracy and popular participation on the other, because good governance requires merit, expertise, technical knowledge, authority, and the like. And I think that democracy demands popular participation. Political decay, in my definition of it, stems from one of 2 sources. First, it's institutional and cognitive rigidity. We create institutions. We human beings love to create rules that govern our lives, but we're also an extremely conservative species. And once we create those rules, they're based on a certain mental model of how the world works. And if it turns out that based on empirical experience, the world isn't working that way, we're oftentimes very hesitant to change the model. I mean, religion is the best case of this because, religious doctrines are, they're rules, they're institutions, but people don't abandon a religious doctrine simply because somehow it doesn't seem to be working out in real life. But, other mental models, Marxism, for example, or even modern neoclassical economics, sometimes these mental models don't actually correspond to empirical reality, and yet people are very reluctant to abandon them. So that's one source of decay, is when you simply don't evolve. The other one that I think is particularly relevant in contemporary America has to do with what political scientists call the elite capture of institutions. Modern institutions are supposed to be impersonal. They're supposed to treat people as citizens, not differently from one another based on whether you're a pal of the president or a member of Congress or something of that sort. And I think one phenomenon that occurs in virtually all political regimes is that the rich and the powerful, particularly, and sometimes it's not only the rich and the powerful, but primarily those, use their access to the political system to politically protect their interests by reducing competition, by creating barriers to entry for other political players, by voting themselves subsidies or protecting their jobs or things of this sort. And that's another factor in political decay, is this capture of state institutions by elites over time. Like many Americans, I'm worried that we're seeing some version of this. We certainly see a number of rigidities in the way we think that institutions need to work, but more worrisome, I think, is just the influence of lobbyists, interest groups, very powerful organized interests that, of course, are legitimate in a democracy, but I think, the contemporary United States exert influence way beyond what they actually represent in the population. And so I think, for that reason, I would say that the United States has been experiencing political decay, and its political institutions are not functioning as well as they could. This doesn't mean that American civilization is in decline, because America has never primarily been about its government. It's been more about the private sector and business and entrepreneurship, and that's booming, and that's, it's been sickly, but it's recovering nicely. But I think American government is in a fair amount of trouble. We can't pass budgets. We can't agree on, really fairly simple, commonsensical kinds of policies, and that's not a good sign. For many countries, the appeal of democracy is very much rooted in just their vision of America, and the fact that America is rich and powerful and prosperous and seems to be doing well. And quite frankly, I think with the amount of political polarization and dysfunction in Washington, that's just not true any longer. Partly it also has to do with foreign policy, the various wars we've engaged in over the past decade, but it also has to do with our own political process. I think that it's hard to say that anyone would turn to Washington and say, yes, you as a young democracy ought to shut down the government because you can't agree on paying your past debts. That's not a model of good behavior for anybody. And therefore, I think American influence in international affairs has diminished as a result of this. And so I think until we get our house in order, that projection of our values and institutions is going to be very much more difficult.